This presentation is on Standard 3, Christian Teachers Understand that Individuals Learn Differently. My name is Dr. Carrie Pfeiffer, and I'll be guiding you through this study of this standard. The standard as described is as follows. The teacher understands how students differ in their approaches to learning and the barriers that impede learning, and then adapts instruction to meet diverse cultural, socioeconomic, and exceptional needs. In the course of this presentation, we are going to look at two major areas of topics. The first is understanding neuroscience, neurodiversity, and its impact on our educational practices. We will take a look at the major structures and their functions within the brain, and we will take a look at the importance of having a growth mindset when approaching a learning experience. And then we will discuss how to apply brain-based learning strategies to aid all learners. We will look at emotions, ways to improve attention and engagement, how to plan for processing and enhanced memory, and then finally the importance of appropriate feedback to our students. All of these components will focus on the fact that we have different kinds of brains and therefore different ways of approaching these different aspects of a lesson. Why does the Christian teacher need to study this particular standard? Well, because in His wisdom, God created neurodiversity, meaning that we all are different. We all think and learn differently, and our brains function differently. He tells us this in 1 Corinthians 12, verse 4. There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them all. And although sometimes being different may not feel like a blessing, difference truly is a blessing. And we should praise that God for the differences that we see not only in ourselves, but in our students. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Psalm 139:14. In his book, Neurodiversity in the Classroom, Thomas Armstrong states it this way. There is no normal brain sitting in a vat somewhere at the Smithsonian or National Institutes of Health to which all other brains are compared. Instead, there are a wide range of brains populating this world. As Christian teachers, these differences in learning need to be valued, capitalized upon, and accounted for in our classrooms. When teachers approach students with an appreciation for and willingness to work with their uniqueness, positive growth can and does occur. Now, we probably all have accepted the fact that every learner is different. But now neuroscience has given us a positive model to show that indeed, structurally, physiologically, and chemically, all brains function slightly differently. So let's take a look at the structures of the brain and their functions. The brain weighs about 3 pounds, the size of a grapefruit, but it is a highly complex organ, probably the most complex functioning organ in the body. There are 2 hemispheres, as you can see in this diagram. The right hemisphere controls the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body. A few years ago, there was a theory out there about left brain or right brain learners, and that theory now, because of the advances we've made in neurodiversity studies, is pretty antiquated. Instead of thinking of the hemispheres as separately operating and influencing factors, the truth of the matter is that cognitive skills are much more complex than this, and that interconnections and communication across those hemispheres is vital for cognitive growth. So let's move into a discussion of the basic structures and how God has helped us learn and grow. The first thing we're going to take a look at is the cortex. It resembles a wrinkled blanket. The little bumps that you see on the outside, the raised bumps, are called the gyri, and these little divots that you see going in are called the sulci. These folds account for extra surface area of the cortex. If we were truly able to take that cortex and unstretch it, we would find that it is much, much larger than it appears when we first look at it on the brain. And this is how God has allowed for brain growth, by the stretching and growing and flexibility of the gyri and the sulci. The cortex is composed of 6 layers and is filled with billions of neurons. Neurons have a gray color to them, thus giving this area of the brain a grayish hue. That's why we sometimes call this the gray matter of the brain. Now, let's move to the back of the brain, to the brainstem area. Some neuroscientists would call the brainstem the reptilian mind, and that is just because it is very basic and survival in function. The brainstem controls all the communication to the spinal cord and all the automatic functions of the body, such as breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure, for example. The next stop is our cerebellum. The cerebellum has the record for holding the most neurons in it. The cerebellum contains the areas that control balance and movement, and also some aspects of learning and memory. This part of the brain receives, sorts, and sends out information to the other parts of the brain, sort of the command central. And because it controls both motor and cognitive skills, it makes a strong case for the interdependence and support for physical activities and learning to happen at the same time. As we move forward into the lobular areas of the brain, God has given us 4 specific areas with 4 specific jobs. And then across the middle of from the parietal to the frontal brain is the stretch called the somatosensory and motor bands. And we'll talk about each of these sections and their job. The occipital lobe is named aptly because it controls the visual processing centers. God has made this part to be a highly efficient area. So therefore, teachers need to capitalize on the efficiency of the occipital lobe and its visual processing by using visuals in instruction. The parietal lobe helps us integrate sensory information from the environment, and it's the visual spatial coordinator. This area helps us know where we are in space and relative to the things around us and how to navigate around these objects. Teachers that understand the function of the parietal lobe will understand the value of practice when it comes to routines and procedures, especially practice that incorporates physical activities. Now we come to that headband area that I referred to before, the motor strip and the somatosensory strip. They go from ear to ear and cross over, as you can see, in the yellow and in the pink. There's a strip on both sides. The motor strip contains areas for various kinds of movements, and that somatosensory strip receives and processes sensations like pain, heat, and touch. The temporal lobe rests near the temple area. This lobe helps us to verbalize and comprehend language. Episodic and declarative memory are also controlled in this area. What I mean by episodic memory is the memory that allows us to recall specific events. And declarative memory is the type of memory that helps us remember facts and figures. We're going to talk more about memory later, but deep within this area of the temporal lobe are 2 structures that are very, very important, the hippocampus and the amygdala. And the hippocampus especially controls short-term and long-term memory. The last stop on the tour of the brain, and also the last stop for development of the brain, is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the area that controls what we call executive function. Executive functions are things like organizational skills, goal setting, delaying gratification, understanding the cause and effect relationship of our actions, and finally making sense out of emotions. This is the last area of the brain to develop, as I said. In fact, full development isn't probably going to happen until the early to mid-20s, or perhaps even later for males especially. Students with learning disabilities will often even see a slower rate than the average rate for development. Now, that doesn't mean that that can't develop. It just means the development is slower, and I think that's really important to remember, that we need to understand that our students can and will develop into the frontal lobe areas of executive control, but it will take each one a little bit of a different timeline, and depending on the complications of their life or their disabilities, could take a bit longer than others. Teachers that understand the frontal function of the frontal lobe and executive function and understand that it takes a long time to develop will then incorporate into their classroom structures that I might refer to as the surrogate frontal lobe, meaning that they have procedures and structures that help students make good choices, that help students understand how to organize, that help students control and think through and process emotional situations, because frankly, they aren't quite ready to do that on their own yet. I think another thing it's important to note here is that the frontal lobe is, because of its importance in executive function, is very important to protect from injury. When we talk about concussions and impact injuries to the brain, when the frontal lobe is damaged, that can definitely slow down, if not completely impair, the student's ability to make these executive control decisions. Neuroplasticity is a term that refers to the ability of the brain to grow and expand. As I mentioned before, the brain weighs about 3 pounds, but in that 3 pounds, there are about 100 billion or more neurons. Now, the whole neuron structure is much more complex than I'm going to explain here, but to help us understand just a bit, I'm going to focus on the basic neuron. The neuron is like a tiny cell, and it's called the communication generator for our brain. It runs electrical-like pathways from different parts of the body to the other. The information comes in through the dendrite, and then is understood and interpreted through the cell body, and as it passes through the axon, it goes to the next neuron. Neurons create what we call pathways or highways for learning. The myelin that you see coats the axon pathway much like a plastic covers an electrical wire. All of the development of neurons and the myelin are important processes in part of brain development. Also, pruning the neurons is a very important part. When a neuron is no longer needed, it's important for the brain to prune it out so that other pathways can be developed. Understanding how neurons can redirect, grow, and prune has changed everything about how we understand intelligence. Well, at least the framework that I was taught with when I was in undergraduate courses. I was taught that IQ did not change, that you were born with a static IQ. It's what God gave you. Make the most that you have and work with what you have. Now, neuroscience has taught me that IQ can be changed. Yes, I said that correctly. IQ can be changed, and it can be changed at any time of your life. There is not necessarily an optimum time for learning, although some areas of development have more rapid neuron growth. God has given us a brain that can improve and strengthen if we make the most of the opportunities He gives us to do so. This knowledge has laid the groundwork for the program called by Carol Dweck, Positive Mind Growth Mindset. It's in opposition to the fixed mindset, which is the one I just described about IQ doesn't change. But a positive growth mindset states that students can and will grow and change and can improve their IQ and overall cognitive function if given the proper opportunities to do so. So at this point in the presentation, I want you to stop the video and discuss this question. How does the information you have just reviewed impact what you do in the classroom? Share at least 2 specific ways that you can change your classroom to support the positive growth mindset in your classroom. When you're done with your discussion, have one member of your group post into the forum on the course page called Mindset a synthesis of your discussion. That will serve as information and guidance for other groups that are also studying this particular standard. Okay, so now that we have reviewed the brain and its wonderful God-given powers, let's examine how understanding and accommodating for these differences can benefit all types of learners in your classroom. Margaret Glick, in her book titled The Instructional Leader and Brain, talks about emotional valence. That's a chemistry term, and it is sort of an apt description here. Just as a molecule has a positive or negative charge, so can a learning environment have a positive or negative charge or impact on its students. Valence is that positive or negative environment. Now, I think it's an inherent pitfall of being a teacher because we're correctors by trade. But I often have found that many teachers, carry this correction idea a bit too far and sometimes rely on negative feedback, insults, sarcasm, negative comments as ways to motivate their students to learn. But those negative experiences and comments and feedback are simply sand in the engine for effective thinking. Negative input and anxiety are huge roadblocks for the learner. In order to convince you of this, I'm going to take you back into the brain, deep into the temporal lobe, to the limbic system. Earlier I mentioned the hippocampus, and when we visited that temporal lobe, the hippocampus and the amygdala are nestled deep within that temporal lobe. These two work in tandem to recognize and process an event as friend or foe. When the hippocampus signals danger, the amygdala springs into action. The amygdala determines if the input will be taken down a careful, slow, measured path of processing, or if it will turn it into a fight or flight response. A negative environment keeps the student's brain functioning on the pathway of flight or fight, which it's extremely energy zapping. However, when a student has a positive experience, the brain moves down the careful and measured path. Positive experiences produce the neurotransmitter called dopamine. We'll talk about dopamine in more detail later, but think of dopamine as the grease on the wheels down that careful and measured learning path. Students receive positive feedback from several things in the classroom. The first and most important feedback area is the relationship between the student and the teacher. Dopamine-producing relationships, as you can see on the left side of this actual brain scan, are produced when we have caring and respectful relationships. It follows that students also then need to have caring and respectful relationships between them and their peers. A very, very powerful processing of dopamine situation. What are some of the elements of a positive interaction? They're seen in body language that's open and available, tone that is credible and approachable, rife with inclusive words like we and us, and bereft of sarcasm. Teachers must make sure that their messages are clear and sincere and that paraphrasing is used when it seems like the students are confused. Teachers must also model active listening behaviors for their students. God created our brains to do complex problem solving. Therefore, when students feel respected by their teachers because they've been given opportunities to engage in complex, relevant, and engaging learning tasks, those pleasure pathways are lubricated by dopamine. This also means that we need to have clear and appropriate procedures for classroom behaviors and procedures, as well as those challenging tasks. A positive learning environment not only depends on the people, and we call that the affective domain, but it also depends on the actual environment itself. Classroom aesthetics are seen in the arrangement of students' desks, the color on the walls, the location of the teacher's desk, the amount of light into the classroom, cleanliness, safety of the physical environment, etc. I'm sure we've all experienced impact on our mood and motivation from our surroundings. It would make sense that the physical environment in our classroom would also have an impact on our students' dopamine production and ability to learn. So take this time right now to stop and discuss this question. What are some of the things in your current classroom environment, both physical and affective, that need some adjustment so that optimum learning can occur? Once you've discussed your classroom, then move to a school-wide discussion. What needs to change in your building, school-wide, to impact both the affective, the person-to-person kinds of interactions, as well as the physical? When you are done, have one member of your group post a synthesis of the discussion into the forum environment. This next session of the presentation deals with attention and engagement. Hopefully I can maintain your attention long enough to keep you engaged. Okay, sorry, that was a bit of a corny joke, but there is an important distinction that I need to make right now between the words attention and engagement. So let's start with my definition of attention. My definition is based on one by Margaret Glick, in which she says, attention is short-term focus needed for survival. What do you need to do in order to be able to be on task and going in my classroom? So how does that reveal itself? For example, when teachers are trying to get their students' attention, they're going to do something novel or unexpected. They might flash the lights or clap their hands or have a student raise their hand until everyone's paying attention. That attention is gained by doing something, what we say, novel, and it is also at an appropriate intensity. When holding attention, the guideline for adults is that it only lasts about 10 minutes before you need to shift an activity. Imagine how much less that number is for younger students. So attention is getting the students to look at you, to become connected to you so that you can deliver information. It's simply getting their attention to the task. Now, before I go to the next step, whenever I use the word attention, many teachers, especially in a discussion such as differences, might move to this concept that I'm talking about attention deficit disorder types of students. I'm not in this discussion talking about attention deficit. All students need attention. You can understand that, I believe, if you go back to thinking about what I just said, that it's getting their focus to the event that's going to be happening, the learning event that's going to be happening. All of our students need to do that. When we talk about things like ADHD, we're talking about a biological condition that affects the ability of a student to attend. They can attend, but their ability to do so is impaired at a different level than those that do not have the disorder. So if teachers improve attention and engagement for the entire classroom, it is going to benefit greatly students with attention disorders, but it is not going to cure their disorders. More structure needs to be in place for kids with attention deficit disorder. Okay, so now I have your attention, but what do teachers do to enhance the steps beyond attention, which we call engagement? Engagement is sustained attention. God has created us to naturally not engage with activities that are boring, irrelevant, extremely difficult, or at least difficult with no payoff in sight, not necessary for survival, or without a reference point or framework. So hey, engagement is simple. Teachers need to teach in a way that's not boring, is relevant to life, has the proper balance of ease and challenge, what I like to call the educational sweet spot, and has scaffolds as needed in place for the students. Now you might be saying that seems a bit too simplistic. Can you give me a bit more to hang my hat on? So I'll share with you a more extensive list of engagement activities as described by Margaret Glick. She states engaging activities need to have the following qualities. They require from the students a personal response. There is a clear model in place that a student can reference when they need to. It ensures emotional safety. You are safe in this class. We care about you. We look for your needs. You are important to us, kinds of ideas. That affective domain. We also need to guarantee the intellectual safety of a student in an engagement activity, meaning they should feel welcome, encouraged, and free to ask questions and not be laughed at or discouraged if someone says that what they've just asked is dumb. So we have to allow them to take educational risks. It should allow for feedback and learning from others. Now that's not just the teacher, but also allows for feedback from student to student. And so if we talk about that feedback, the feedback also needs to be frequent and helpful, and we'll talk on that a little bit later. It gives the students choice in their activities and in their response format. Great research has been done to show that if you want to motivate a student, the number one way to increase motivation is to allow them choices. As long as we're speaking about choices and format, we need to have a variety of formats for the lesson so that we hit on different aspects of learning styles. These activities need to be authentic. I'm sure we've all heard students ask the question, how does this apply to real life? And that's a valid question. Activities that highly engage students will somehow demonstrate a connection to their real life. Rigor. Many people think that when we modify or accommodate or change activities for students that we somehow are watering down the curriculum. And in fact, the opposite should be true. If you truly are modifying and accommodating appropriately, the rigor is maintained at a very high level. There needs to be relevance to their current situation in life. What does this have to do with me today? And what can I contribute to the learning experience? When the activity is completed, the student needs to feel competent and that they've mastered the skill. And finally, there needs to be some familiarity. And some of these ideas, I think, tend to overlap on each other, and that probably is a good thing because it emphasizes the importance of all of these different ideas when we're trying to engage students. So now it's time to stop and discuss again. What would you propose to implement into your classroom to increase levels of attention and engagement? When you're done with your discussion, have a member of your group post into the forum engagement a synthesis of that discussion. The next section is going to talk about planning with processing in mind. Have you ever listened to a presentation and then at the end asked yourself, what did I just listen to? What did I just hear? Hopefully that's not the case with this presentation, but when students have difficulty recalling and sharing the information they just heard, they're having issues with processing. Time available in this presentation won't allow me to dissect the neurological importance of processing, but I'm going to give you a brief diagram adapted from the work again of Marjorie Glick to help give you an overview of what we're talking about and the importance of all of these ideas in the idea of processing. So we discussed earlier the importance of relevance in engagement. Relevance could be put on a continuum like this: highly irrelevant events on the continuum to a very relevant event or lesson structure. Now when we talk about relevance, there's two things that really go into relevance. It's important to the content of the immediate and future lives of your students as well as the background knowledge that they bring to the learning experience. And this is where savvy teachers will tweak. If a student is coming in with a weak background knowledge, by giving them some background knowledge, you're increasing their relevance and thereby increasing engagement. It all kind of goes together. We also talked about that affective domain, how we feel emotionally in our classroom. When we can have a very high stressful situation, and we can also then have a continuum to lower stressors. So now as you see, these two lines cross and make 4 quadrants. And the quadrants represent where a student could be in the learning process. Of course, we want them to be where the star is, where activities are highly relevant to them and they're feeling very little stress within the classroom. That's our optimum engagement continuum area. So how do you get students to this place on the learning continuum? Classrooms that are processing friendly use structures that utilize multiple modalities, allow time for processing, and use formative assessments to determine if that processing has actually happened. Now, I believe you all understand the importance of multiple modalities. We've been hearing about that probably since the first time we stepped foot into a teaching classroom. We understand that there are visual modalities, auditory modalities, and kinesthetic modalities. And all of these are important to consider, and that is also based obviously on brain science. I talked about the occipital lobe and how highly functional that is, and that kinesthetic activities link activities across the lobes of our brain. So all of this is extremely important to remember, but I have to believe that you understand that. But something that we need to think about is what goes beyond lesson content, how we deliver the content, versus what do the kids actually bring in their brains to the learning experience. Think about this as exercise for the brain. We all know the importance of exercise. The more we use a muscle, the stronger it gets and the more efficient it gets at operating. And the brain is a muscle too. So I'm going to talk about right here some activities and things that you can do that are like sit-ups for the brain. They're the bedrock of cognitive skills that everybody needs strengthened to improve their thinking and memory. This is where neuroplasticity comes into play. You've probably heard of some programs that I'm going to mention, such as LearningRx, CogMed, or on TV you've seen commercials for Luminosity. These are all examples of programs that exercise the brain through the strengthening of that bedrock cognitive skills. They're not tutoring programs in math or reading. They're strengthening things like attention, memory, recall, processing speed. Now, a program that I've used quite successfully in my classroom, and I've also helped many WELS schools and students implement it into their lives and families, is a program called Brainware Safari. Now, Brainware Safari, again, is a cognitive skills training program. The reason I like Brainware Safari is, number one, it's very affordable when you compare it to the other programs that I mentioned. It is also web-based, so a student uses a computer to practice these skills. So it's something that can be done during a study time at school. It can be done in free time in a special program after school. It can be done whenever the student has time on the protocol. The protocol for Brainware Safari is 12 weeks of 30 to 40 minutes each session, working through these exercises within this program. It looks a little bit like a video game and operates different activities to strengthen different skills. Now, when following the protocol of 12 weeks, there are numerous research studies on Brainware Safari that have shown that the students following the protocol have improved their IQ from beginning of the 12-week to the end of the 12-week protocol by 3 to 4 years. That's a phenomenal growth in that amount of time. And it is a growth that doesn't regress. Once the strengthening is there, the students appear then to be able to maintain and work even farther forward. And it goes without saying that if you improve a student's cognitive IQ skills, their academic achievement is also going to increase. And this is what I have seen in Brainware Safari on a personal level and through their research studies as well. They do a research study every year to maintain that what they're doing is working. So if you're interested in Brainware Safari, I put the link to their website there so you can kind of look at the studies yourself, see what the program looks like, and if you're interested in more information on how I can help you or your school get Brainware Safari going into your programs, simply contact me at the email that you saw at the beginning of the presentation. So let's move on now to processing time again and talk about something that I think you probably again all understand, but we need to be reminded of this often because I know I violate this often within my instructional units as well. And that's the importance of wait time. Everyone, including us, needs time to process a question, retrieve that information to answer the question, and then formulate a response. And that's all needs to be done before we open our mouth and talk. So it's vital that we remember students need time between a question and an expected response in order to process the question. But processing time that I'm speaking about includes more than just these questions. Some students process more efficiently by talking out loud. Some students are social learners and need an oral rehearsal to decode, encode, and respond to a message. The social learning preference can actually be culturally based. For example, Hispanic cultures tend to be much more talk-oriented, and therefore that kind of cultural propensity for processing time and processing format needs to be understood, accepted, and supported in your classrooms. Now, when you dump stress into the equation, you create an issue for students. One of the greatest stressors in a classroom would be the testing situations. Because our students are uniquely minded, some may require more time in test-taking situations. That just needs to be accepted as a given. How do you as a teacher set up testing times can promote or work against the stress level of testing in your classroom? For example, just one thing. How do students turn in the test when they're done? Do they get out of their seat, bring it to the desk, giving it to you, the teacher, to then be corrected? Just that simple procedure can create undue stress on students who are slower in processing. They see others are done, I'm not done, I need to just finish this and get it done so that I don't look different, or there must be something wrong with me because I'm not done now. So a solution to that kind of thing is to allow for a structure where when the student is done, they simply turn the paper over or indicate in some way where you, who should be circulating through the classroom during a testing situation anyway, can quietly and easily pick up the paper. However, you need to also keep in mind that some students, in order to process, need a quieter environment than others. Is your classroom allowing for quiet and focus, or is it constructed in such a way that a student that needs that extra focus time and that quiet isn't getting that? Then you need to address that as well in how you test that student. Or you're simply not getting a good read on what that student has learned. So, since we're talking about assessments, let's wrap up our discussion of processing with a discussion of formative assessments. Formative assessments are those steps within a lesson that indicate to you as the teacher the student's ready to take the next part of the lesson on. Formative assessments are brief, and yet an understanding of how to construct a good formative assessment isn't just short discussions. So I'm just going to try to give you an overview here so that you understand the function of a formative assessment and perhaps then pay more attention to those formative assessments within your own classroom. So as I said before, a formative assessment has as its purpose to indicate if a student has mastery or mystery on a concept that you just taught. This concept will be a small piece of a bigger unit of instruction. If the student has mastered that piece of information, they can step into the next lesson. If they have not mastered, they need to stay on that step and review. Or maybe they totally are not even ready for what you tried to teach them and need to take a step back and review the previous concept in order to be ready to move up to the next step. So think of formative assessments as determining where on the ladder, where on the stairs of that educational unit the student is. So you can see formative assessments are crucial for you to have within your units of instruction. Now, you're probably thinking, oh, that sounds like a lot of assessment design. But formative assessments don't need to be formal. They don't need to be a quiz in nature, although that is an okay way to have an formative assessment. But think of some informal tools that you can use to review to see if a student understands what's been going on. You could have a question and answer period at the end of the class. With a formal structured question and answer period, you should be able to get some type of idea if the student is understanding. Or maybe you'll have them write a journal reflection explaining what they learned today in class, a learning log, so to speak. You can learn a lot from those log entries to decide if the student is ready to move on. However, one tool that's really excellent and easy and very informative to a teacher is an exit card. Now, every lesson you teach obviously has an objective. So on an exit card, you would ask the objective in the form of a question. Somehow the student has to demonstrate their understanding of the objective or their understanding of the process that you are trying to teach. An exit card would have several examples or things that they need to complete, but very, very short and sweet. They fill this card out before they leave the classroom and leave the card with you. Then the teacher takes a look at those exit cards and sorts them into, hey, they've got it, move them on. These kids need a bit of a review, or these kids need to step back into the stairs of learning that we had shown before. So you sort your piles and then determine what you're going to do the next day in your instructional time to meet the needs of those students. I'm going to show you now a short video from the Teacher Learning channel on exit cards. And it'll give you an example, an idea of how one teacher uses an exit card strategy at the end of a lesson, a math lesson.
Please make sure you hand in your calculator at the end. Calculator and exit card. I'm Marie Barchi. I've never not done an exit card. It's something I just do every day. It just comes natural with it's part of every lesson. Okay, our aim today is how do we solve and graph 1- and 2-step linear inequalities? What would I have to replace example 1 with to make it an inequality? Lillian?
Change the equal sign.
To what?
Greater than or less.
Right. You would have to change. That's what an inequality is. It's a mathematical statement in which the equal sign is replaced with one of the four symbols. I went into what an inequality was. I did several examples, and we went over the steps it takes. I showed them when you divide by a negative, you flip your inequality symbol. Then we went to two-step. And then I completed that by having students come up to the board and put their work up. Graph it right underneath. Someone to put up 8. Alicia. And number 9, Ashley. As I walk around whilst other students are presenting their work, I really get a feel for who's struggling. Okay, this you should always cross-multiply your variable first. You know, when you walk by their paper and the problem's not done, it's because they clearly couldn't do it. And that's kind of how I identify at the end of the period who is getting which of the 2 exit cards. Okay, guys, you're going to work on the exit card now. There's 2 questions. You have more than enough time. On your way out, where does it go? In the box. Very nice. Need help anyway. I give a grade level exit card and I give an above grade level exit card. Let's review our steps while I hand out the exit card. What steps do we take to solve and graph 1 and 2 step linear inequalities? I always make sure before I hand out the exit card that I summarize my lesson. What is step number 2, which only happens sometimes, Ashley?
You flip the sign.
The fact that we reviewed that you need to flip your inequality sign when you multiply or divide by a negative number reinforced that right before they worked on the exit card. So maybe not all of them got that right, but most of them are like, oh my God, we just went over that, I have to flip it. So I think that it's important to review your aim. Don't forget to graph the second one. That counts as points, graphing the second one. What's your answer here?
-2.
So if it's less than -2, which choice are you picking?
2 swags.
Please make sure you hand in your exit card. The kids are constantly asking me, can we have our exit card back from the day before? We want to see how we did on our exit card. They want to make sure they're up to speed. Good. Who will you assign to Tuesdays for extra help? I have the students who did not as well on their 8th grade assessment, so they're the lower end math students in their grade, so they get a double period of math every other day, which is nice. I'm grouping them by how they did on their exit card. Basically, the kids who totally didn't get it, I'll put in one group. The average kids go usually in 2 different groups because there's so many of them, and then the above average go in a separate group. Rashawn, you're going to the orange. Noelle, you're going to just have a seat right over here. Charisse, you're going by Salvador. We're just reinforcing what we did yesterday on the 1 and 2 step linear inequalities. Today you'll see I'll have 15 students in my enrichment class, and I'll really be able to work with those kids to make sure they understand how to solve 1 and 2 step linear inequalities before moving on to something like multi-step, where they have to distribute and have a variable on both sides. The strategy of using exit cards I definitely think could be used across the board in high schools and middle schools for several subject areas. Good. You flip that one and that one's right. This we got to switch back, right? Regardless of what subject you're teaching, there are lower end students there, and they really need that extra support. And I think it's important that every teacher offers that to them. You have to graph that way. You graph that way.
I think it's important to note that on this particular example, you might have gotten the impression that an exit card is graded. And it's really important to explain to students that this is not a formally graded quiz, but it's simply a way for you to know what they know or what they need help on so that you can better instruct them the next day. If you put a grade on an exit card, you really are then turning it more into something that could be a stressful situation for a student and not an opportunity for them to show what they know or what they need to learn. Okay. Students not only need to support to improve their processing, but then once that information has been processed, they need a way to move it from short-term memory to long-term memory, a way to retain and retrieve the information. So we need to spend a few minutes now exploring memory. And when we talk about memory, we're going to talk about 3 phases of memory that work together. The 3 major phases that we're going to talk about are short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Those are the 3 boxes that you see down the middle. Short-term memory lasts just a few seconds. It is the immediate understanding of what's going on in the classroom. So how would that look in a classroom if we were in the middle of a lesson? Short-term memory might be what it takes for the student to understand the lesson goal for the day. Today we are going to learn about this. Then it's time for the working memory to take over. Once the student understands or knows what the instructional goal is, then it's time to practice and work on that. That's why I like the name working memory, because it does take practice and work to move it into that area of the mind. It isn't obviously a short-term memory, but it isn't a very long memory process either. Maybe even 15 to 30 seconds is all that's needed to move something into the working memory area. So let's look at it this way. It might be what it takes for a student to process and create a question to ask the teacher. Long-term memory is the indefinite time. Long-term memory is how long it takes for a student to formulate a question and answer that question on a test. Research done by Schachter in 2001 supports the idea that what a student is taught at the beginning of the learning event is the most crucial learning time. So he likes to call it the golden time of learning. So if that's true, and it is supported by research, then it behooves you as a teacher to make the most of the beginning time of a lesson, the optimum learning time, and teach the most important concepts for the day right away at the start of the learning period. Now, for elementary students, we like to think of it in segments or chunks of 10 minutes and then 2 minutes of switching. And then you can go back to a new concept again, another 10 minutes, and then another 2 minutes of some other type of instruction. For older students, high school students, that can be bumped up to a 20-minute unit of instruction, chunk of instruction, and then again, 2 minutes of a different active kind of behavior. These golden chunks, these 10-minute chunks with a break or 20-minute chunks with a break, are when teachers need to create the optimum learning of the concept or skill they're trying to accomplish for that day. The shift is just as important. Those 2 minutes of shift time or practice time or some sort of physical activity time, something different than what you were doing in the lesson, helps push the information into the working memory. Now, when I really had to shift my mindset when I learned this about the optimum golden period, starting right away with the major concepts of the lesson for that day. Because the way I had normally taught was I spent the first part of the lesson, probably that good 10 to 20 minutes of a lesson every day, reviewing what we learned the day before. Now sometimes my lesson is a review lesson, and that's completely appropriate. However, if I'm going to teach new content that day, it's really important to start the day with new content, because those are the golden learning opportunities. And it makes sense that what you learn at the beginning, when your mind is fresher and more engaged, is going to be the things that you remember best. So I don't really want them necessarily using their optimum learning period, their golden time, to review something that I already have taught and they have practiced. I'm going to spend that time on the new concept. This was a pretty big shift for me, but I found that when I have adjusted my lessons this way, I have students that are more engaged, more motivated, and quite honestly, seem to be more effective in learning the concept. So it was definitely worth the change and shifting in my mind. Now, I talked about those chunks, the 10 and the 2, or the 20 and the 2. And there's something else to keep in mind. Research has shown that these chunks of ideas are called, we're going to call them M-spaced concepts, indicate in these chunks how much a student can completely learn during an instructional time. And I think it probably makes sense that as you look at this graph here, that the younger the student, the fewer instructional units, M spaces, you can have in a lesson. For example, a 5-year-old can have 2 of those learning chunks in any lesson. So 10 minutes, 2, 10 minutes, 2. Perhaps even a child that young, I might say 5 minutes and 2, and 5 minutes and 2. As the student gets older, the chunk increases. Age 7, there's 3 units that can happen in a lesson. And by age 15, you can put 6 instructional units within a learning time frame. So if you're talking 10 minutes, you could theoretically have over an hour of instruction within a unit. Now we know that that doesn't necessarily translate really well to a regular schedule, but in a block schedule that would be exactly what we would need to do. So it's important to keep in mind that we don't assault their processing by giving them far too much to learn within that learning session. So for the next activity, I'm going to ask you to read a research article. I've got two on the website for you by Judy Willis. Both of them are about memory, focus, and motivation. Or if you wish to, you can find an article of your own that's current within the last 5 to 10 years that talks about processing or memory. Share with your group 2 takeaways that you had gained from the reading of that article. When you are all done discussing your takeaways, have a member of your group post into the discussion forum called Memory a synthesis of what was discussed. Being able to read the synthesis ideas of other groups will be very helpful as we think about as teachers how to enhance processing and memory in our classrooms. The final portion of this standard module will discuss the importance of feedback. And feedback also that takes into mind the many different types of learners in your classroom. Feedback at the proper time can redirect a student that has misunderstood a task or process. Proper feedback can motivate and encourage. However, it is really important to understand what contributes to proper feedback so that we don't unintentionally send students the incorrect message or maybe even discourage or frustrate a student. Glick calls proper feedback the Miracle-Gro of a learning cycle. So let's get some Miracle-Gro ideas so that the feedback we provide our students truly helps them learn and grow as learners. In order to understand the importance of feedback, I'm going to take you back into the brain again, deep into that structure of the hippocampus where memories are processed. The chemical dopamine that I talked about before is formed when we have positive experiences. Dopamine is crucial. It's that grease on the wheels of the learning process. It is linked specifically to promoting motivation, enhancing memory, and increasing focus. When a person experiences a positive experience, the brain literally squirts dopamine into the area of the amygdala, and thereby that positive experience creates the dopamine that creates motivation, enhances their memory, and gives them more focus. So it's such an intertwined process. I hope that you can understand how important positive feedback is because it creates a very real chemical and physical effect in the brains of your students. Now, the level of feedback must be geared to the situation. When you have a situation in your classroom when stakes are high, such as a testing situation, or when confusion is present, or fear is present, or emotions are at a very high level, the feedback needs to be very frequent, very focused, and very specific to the task. The opposite of that kind of feedback is a more general feedback. Feedback that we would give to send a general message like, great job, you're all on task, this is the direction we need to be going, keep up the good work, and it's a general encouragement. The specific feedback is for higher stress levels and requires a more specific response, whereas when you're giving general feedback to keep students moving forward, it can be general in nature. Now, there are 3 ways you as a teacher give feedback: verbal, written, and demonstrative. Verbal feedback is used when the response requires more immediate attention, or it is a longer response, something that maybe can't be addressed efficiently in a note. Written feedback is given when you need to address what they're doing in a more formal way, and very important, it's to use written feedback when the student needs to review what you've said and come back and perhaps even make changes. But the third kind of feedback that we give is demonstrative feedback, and this is often the feedback that we unintentionally send the wrong message with. If we raise our eyebrow in question, smirk, frown, give them a different kind of eye movement, or even lose eye contact with the student, that message that we're unintentionally sending them is negative. So a teacher has to be very careful when giving that kind of feedback to make sure that their facial and gestural images match the message they're trying to send. And it's really important that that kind of feedback especially is positive and planned, because a student will only be able to judge what they see, not what they hear or read, based on that kind of feedback. Now, demonstrative feedback has a very important role. That is, if a student is in the middle of a process or a conversation or an activity and you don't want to interrupt what they're doing with words or making them read something, your visual gestural cues are really important feedback. Now, let's take another look at different kinds of feedback, tools that we can use within a lesson, within instructional time, that will help a student understand what they're doing. And the first one we're going to look at is I'm sure you're very well acquainted with, is the example of a rubric. Now, rubrics should be constructed, and I'm not saying this is a good example here, I'm just using the rubric as a visual, but rubrics are constructed on a continuum of feedback, so you have a scale within them, and specifics, as you can see down the left side, of what the excellence would be if it was demonstrated at that level. A rubric, if it's to be effective, needs to be fully, completely understood by the students before they begin the learning task. Teachers must have the rubrics created and in the hands of the student by the time the task is assigned. Then, as the student works on the task, they can refer to that rubric to move their product to the quality level that they want it to be. Hopefully that's the excellent area. But whatever they do, they have criteria that they can match their work against. Another written form of feedback is a task card or a task map. A task card breaks the task down into measurable visual steps of the process. As a student progresses from the beginning to the end of the process, there's a check-off that must occur. Most often, the teacher would check off, yes, this is done, move forward. This type of feedback gives the student encouragement, you've completed this step, you're ready for the next step. So it's a little bit different than a rubric. Peer feedback can be a very useful tool in the classroom. However, successful peer feedback sessions have to have clear format and a clear structure for both the sender and the receiver of the information. Without that structure, peer sessions can degrade to painful experiences for one or both of the people involved. Another tool for feedback is having the student complete a personal reflection on the experience. This could be a journal or some type of question response, as I showed you before, or it could be something like a checklist. Now again, this isn't necessarily the greatest example of a checklist. It's simply an idea that you can use where the student looks at the criteria and says, I have done this. That gives them self-evaluation. And then after they have self-evaluated that they've completed these activities, the teacher provides them input, yes, you have, this is where you are. So self-reflection often can lead them to resolve issues or questions that they might have had before they come to you as the teacher. Now, during a lesson of instruction, if you need feedback from your students, you might simply be able to use what some people call the 5-finger rubric, where if a student holds up 1 finger, that means I'm confused, and 2, I'm a little unclear and need help to understand, 3, I'm pretty clear, but I just have a question to ask, and 4 is I'm ready to work. 5 is I could teach this concept to somebody else. At a certain point in a lesson, when a teacher asks for a 5-finger rubric, it helps them understand who they need to pull aside and work more with, or perhaps match a 5 to a 1 or a 3 to a 5, and have other students helping each other get through that lesson content. It can be a pretty quick assessment. Now, other things that teachers can use during this time might be to utilize the technology in their classroom. With the advent of interactive whiteboards, we've also come up with student feedback systems, the clickers or the boards that students use to respond to a teacher question, and the teacher can take a quick snapshot of where students are in the lesson. It's really important to use those tools. It's a very efficient way and engaging way for students to let you as a teacher know what they know. But if you don't have an interactive whiteboard, or you might not have the student response systems that are a part of that board yet, you can use the lower tech solution by just simply using a whiteboard and marker and have the students write on that board the response to a prompt or a question. Another form of feedback that can be given by the teachers as the students are working is coming around the desks and putting on perhaps a sticker, a stamp, or just a marker, and using a marker and putting a dot on their paper if they're on the right track, if they seem to be learning the concept and demonstrating that they are understanding the concept. It keeps that student moving forward. A student that doesn't get a dot then has the opportunity to ask the teacher and work with the teacher a little bit more to get them moving forward so that they can understand the process. So, knowing how important it is to keep the dopamine created by positive feedback flowing during your instruction, teachers probably really need to pay attention in their lesson plans to mark natural spots where feedback is going to need to happen. And in that area, when they mark it, what kind of feedback is going to happen and when is very important. As you become more experienced at giving feedback, these ideas will become more natural. Feedback is so vital to the success of your students. So I know that I've emphasized that feedback is important and a positive thing in learning, but I also want you to understand that how we give feedback, when we give feedback, and the sincerity with which we give feedback is very important. And to emphasize that with you, I'm going to have you watch a short video clip created by David Walsh based on some research that he and his daughter did on giving feedback.
Well, praising our kids comes naturally to most of us.
But what if we told you that some praise is better than others, and some kinds of praise could actually hold our kids back? That is what researchers at Stanford University found using grade school kids and a fascinating puzzle test. So we put their test to the test, saw some surprising results, and found 4 easy ways to help parents solve the praise puzzle. From the moment our children are born, as parents, we know our words will shape how they learn. It's why we choose our words so carefully, why we are often so quick to praise. But is all praise good praise? We set up a test to find out.
It's going to be one by one.
Using these kids and these puzzles.
Your job is to see if you can make this pattern right there.
Dr. David Walsh and his daughter Erin conducted the test. They're experts in children's brain development and the founders of Mind Positive Parenting. They divided the kids into 2 groups and gave them puzzles to solve. One group was praised for their intelligence.
You're really good at this, though. You're good at puzzles.
The other, working on the same puzzles, was praised for their effort.
You're a hard worker. You just keep plugging away, which is really great.
We had them do more puzzles and found a subtle difference in wording had a major difference in how the kids responded.
You want to try the harder one?
Yeah. When kids who were praised for being good at puzzles had to choose between doing another easy one or a more challenging one, the choice was easy.
You want to go back to the type of puzzle that you did first that was a little bit easier? Or do you want to keep sticking with this one and see what happens?
I want to go back to the one that...
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
But the kids who were praised for their hard work made the difficult choice.
Do you want to keep working on this tough one, or do you want to go back to the easy one?
I'll work on this for a little bit. I'll work on this for a little bit.
Okay, that's good.
Even when that choice was a bit of a surprise.
Do you enjoy working at things like this?
No, not really.
You could either choose to do this one all over again. Okay.
That'll be pretty easy. I want to do the different one.
It does make sense that if you praise kids for their hard work, they're going to want to work harder, just like adults.
In fact, our only exception helped prove the rule.
Wow. You are really good at puzzles.
Hannah chose the hard puzzle, even though she was simply praised for intelligence.
I would rather do this one because if you do so many easy ones, you can only learn so much.
A surprise to us, but not to her mother, because hard work has always been emphasized in her family.
She's a smart kid, but I think being the hard worker and knowing that that's what it takes to be successful, it feels like it's part of our kind of our motto at home.
So my little effort to kind of drive her in the other direction was overwhelmed by what she usually hears.
So they were offered a choice.
Our test was based on a larger study at Stanford University, where Dr. Carol Dweck found the wrong kind of praise can have the wrong kind of results.
Probably because I'm not good at these problems.
Although we worked with 7 through 11-year-olds, the Walshes say the results apply to all kids and all parents.
When we praise kids too much, they start to become dependent upon it. They start to look for it. And, you know,
Praise addict. Sounds crazy, but Dr. Walsh says too much praise can actually cause problems.
if we're constantly telling kids how smart they are, then they can inadvertently start to interpret a mistake as a failure.
So how can we support our kids without stunting their growth? The Walshes have 4 solutions to the praise puzzle.
You really worked hard at that. You kept at it, you concentrated. Nice work.
Praise effort rather than ability. Be specific so kids know exactly what they're doing right. Be sincere, because kids know when it's just lip service. And be intermittent with your praise.
You know, not using praise as a fire hose, but using it sort of appropriately, because it starts to mean more.
Dr. Walsh says that parents should remember one thing. Self-esteem is built on competence and achievement. And effort and hard work are major ingredients of competence and achievement. And you can find more parenting tips from the Walshes on their Mind Positive Parenting website, and we did put a link to it at wcco.com/links.
I hope that you learned from this video some important takeaways on feedback, and I would ask that you have a member of your group post into the discussion forum called Feedback a synthesis of what you as a group have learned about feedback during our discussion as well as the watching of the video. This will be your last activity for this module of the Standard 3. If you're interested in learning more about neurodiversity, I would encourage you to review the reading list provided on the course page. Many of the sources on that list were utilized in the creation of this module. Also, the Mind Positive Parenting website is a great resource for both teachers and especially for parents, and it's filled with information that I think would be very wonderful to use for parent-teacher discussions and groups as well, because it gives parents real tools. The 2 books by David Walsh on the reading list are excellent reads for all of you as teachers, as well as I would encourage you to share those resources with parents as well. So, Standard 3, Christian teachers understand that individuals learn differently. I hope that I didn't just convince you that that's true, but showed you some strategies and how to deal with those differences in a very effective and compassionate way as a Christian teacher. Again, my email is listed there. If you have further questions on any of the things that were discussed in the standard, I'd be happy to direct you to further resources if you're interested. Thank you.